Africa was extremely critical in the early church. In fact, Africa was critical to the way that we articulate the core foundations of the Christian faith today. I'm Pastor Robert. I'm a visiting professor at Now Theological College, and I'll explain it. In the early church, the church in Africa was extremely influential, roughly on par with Rome. And Africa had the foremost center of theological education in the early church for its first 1,000 years, followed closely by the Church of Antioch. In fact, the African church even influenced Martin Luther in how he wanted to reform the Catholic Church more into the image of the early church before the Protestant schism, which today is called the Reformation, took place. This is the seminar I presented. Our last video, part 1, was Africa in the Bible. This is Africa in the early church. It's the Zoom presentation, so please like, share, subscribe, tell a friend to tell a friend. Let's get right into it. We're seeing the same map again. And notice here that we've met or added Alexandria, right? Alexandria was one of the primary sees of the early church. And there were actually it was a triarchy at first after the Council of Nicaea of Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome, and they were the chief three sees in the early church. The Roman Church, the Catholic Church as we understand it today, did not exist then. The Catholic Church as we know it today did not come into being until the 11th century during the Great Schism of the year 1054. So the churches here, the early church, were not the Catholic Church. They were what is called the Orthodox Church. And then in 1054, the Catholic Church broke away from the Orthodox Church. Actually, the two excommunicated each other over doctrinal differences, and the Catholic and the Church of Rome wanting to have a superiority over the other churches, which they wouldn't accept, which they never had before and wouldn't accept. But here we have Alexandria, and Alexandria actually was quite remarkable in that time because it was actually the center of learning and the center of scholarship for the Christian church in the early centuries. Rome was actually a minor church. It was honorific because of the presence of Peter and Paul there, and they were given sort of like Justice John Roberts over the Supreme Court. They didn't have authority, but they were sort of like the Chief Justice of the churches, that a similar role back then. But Alexandria actually was a scholarship center even before then. We have writings of like Philo the Jew, who was around the time of Jesus in the first century, and that's he was not a believer, but he actually had things like a canon, a list of what became a canon for the Jewish scriptures, and that's how we know that the apocryphal books were not really considered scripture throughout Judaism. And so there was Philo the Jew. There was also what was called the Catechetical School of Alexandria, and this was an incredible source of learning. It was a place where theology was developed, where significant theology, and they contributed a lot to they were the center of church teaching of the academics. Europe didn't have any such center for about a millennium. They started around in the 1200s, having these colleges and universities, right? So, but in the early church, before the schism, that's when, Alexandria was really the seat and center of Christian learning. And it was one of the Petrarchy or Triarchy, the chief three, but there in certain parts of church history, there were three, and sometimes there were five. So there were Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and then also Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome were like the chief three. And then there was a Petrarchy or five churches that included Jerusalem and Constantinople a little later on. But Alexandria was always one of those chief places. And then there are a lot of really amazing saints that came out of there, famous martyrs. Another thing that's remarkable about the Egyptian church, which became the Coptic church that we know today, is that they held true to the faith while the Egyptian pagans actually adopted some of the Greek and Roman gods and changed the names of their gods to Greek and Roman names and capitulated. So there's another group in Black communities that I didn't mention before, but it's called Kemetic, Kemetic spirituality or Kemetics. And they're very, and all of the different groups try to say how, try to make up these stories about getting our religion from Egyptian gods and all of that. And that's absolutely the opposite of history. What really happened is that the Christians resisted that, and they abandoned those gods and died in gladiator arenas. They were persecuted, they were killed, they were tortured, they were executed in large numbers, taken to arenas and eaten by wild beasts. And they did all of that rather than even change the name or adopt any of the names of these Egyptian gods. It was the Egyptian pagans that actually made that change and adopted the European gods, not the Egyptian Christians. So some of the people that came out of there were a very famous theologian named Origen. And Origen was a brilliant genius. He put together a book called the Hexpla, which was a parallel translation in 6 different languages of the Holy Scriptures of the New Testament scriptures. And so that was one of them. He was one of the most famous and well-known teachers there, and he was also a very famous apologist. He would combat things like Gnosticism. Turns out that Gnosticism came from Egypt as well. So it wasn't just, it was great theologians, but it was also great heretics. So Valentius and some of them and his predecessors of Gnosticism arose in Alexandria and in Egypt. The extent of this is that at the time of the 1st century, there was, when Eusebius was writing the history of the church, he had estimated that 1 out of 8 citizens in Egypt was Jewish. So these were, so the Jews had a very prominent presence in Egypt and Africa. So there were a lot of, and then just, to flip that around, that means there were a lot of African Jews, right? And then also the Jews that came down from Cush, and so it came up from Cush and so forth as well. Another, let's see what else. Yeah, and then again in the early church, remember the prophecy that God gave back in Isaiah that said that Egypt, that blessed be my people Egypt, right? Egypt became this bastion of Christianity after the ascension of Jesus Christ back into heaven. So this is a really stunning fulfilled prophecy, that God is, that God had prophesied 500 or 600. Isaiah was about 600 years before it actually happened. Really amazing. Okay, another one is, let's see what else here we have. Okay, so we'll get to that in a second. All right, so then we'll have the gospel, right? Okay, so now let's go back and see how the gospel came. Strong tradition has it that Peter sent Mark from Rome to Alexandria, to Egypt, to start the church there. Now, what happens is that both in Alexandria and in Ethiopia, in Egypt and Ethiopia, the historical records are going to be lagging, and we'll explain why in a second. But what will happen is that Mark went down to Alexandria to establish the church in Egypt, and then also Matthew. There's strong tradition from Matthew that Matthew actually went from either Rome or Jerusalem to Cush to establish the church in Ethiopia, and the tradition has him meeting with the Ethiopian eunuch. Now, history, the traceable history or recorded history, there's a difference, okay? But recorded history from the mainstream will say that Ethiopia had very early conversion to Christianity as a Christian nation, and then there was a king, I think Fiducius was his name, but he actually made Christianity the official religion of Ethiopia, and they were very faithful even through today with that. Now, Matthew going there, it doesn't contradict, because Matthew going there with the Ethiopian eunuch being there, it takes a while for Christianity to settle and to germinate in a culture before it reaches the upper classes, right? There was some critique from an Alexandrian, an African fellow in Alexandria. His name was Clephas. I think his name was Clephas. That he said that these Christians are no good. All they do is these poor, uneducated waifs are the only ones that believe in them, and they're the only ones that appeal to. So what happens is, and that's right in concert with what the Bible says, that see that there's not many wise and not many noble of you that are called, but it's the low things that God is called to confound the high. And the gospel, Jesus Christ came to preach the gospel to not the rich, but to the poor. And so the poor aren't recorded in history books. They don't write theology treatises. And so it takes a while for Christianity to percolate among the poor before it percolates up to the more wealthy, and then they start getting converted, and the more powerful start getting converted, and that's typically the pattern, and that's one of the reasons why that the records of Jesus come usually the secular records come after his crucifixion, some years after his crucifixion, is because he had a bunch of like 500 fishermen and manual laborers as followers, and they wouldn't spread this gospel, and nobody in the Roman government was recording what they did because they weren't on the radar. All right, so Matthew went down to Cush, Mark went down to Alexandria, and those were that's where the first Christianity started back there, and then it became greater until it became the official religions of both countries. So in the early African church, we have over 90 African saints that are named, and 30 of those have official days on the Orthodox liturgical calendar. And these are, pictures of some of them, and there's lists of those that you can provide and share with you if you'd like. But among like Catholic and Orthodox, there's a list of 90 African saints that are canonized saints in these traditions. The Ethiopian eunuch we all know about. Then there's also Alexandria, which we've discussed a bit, and then Ethiopia, which we've discussed a bit more. But one thing about Ethiopia too is that Ethiopia was preserved by God, and they've never really been conquered or colonized. And when the Muslims started taking over, they tried to take Ethiopia and didn't. Now their story is that Ethiopian kings treated Muhammad well and so forth. And there's two other sides of it that they're not going to tell. One is that the Ethiopian army was pretty fearsome, and they had archers that could shoot you in the throat from like 1,000 feet away. They were miraculous, very, very skilled archers. And so you can imagine Muhammad sitting there, and then whoop, what happened to Akbar? Well, he got shot in the throat. And so then all of a sudden, he gets this revelation, oh, well, God doesn't want us to, he wants us to have mercy on these people. So then he goes on and finds easier targets. But, and then the Ethiopian, now we're going to see how Ethiopia actually impacts the Reformation a little later on. But Ethiopia has been a longstanding church of faithfulness, and God has preserved and protected them when all around them have fallen, including the churches in Sudan, for instance. So now some of the famous African saints that we can talk about, and there are many, of course, but there's, again, 90 of them, more than that. Perpetua and Felicity, these were two young ladies that were actually Egyptian, African, very rich daughters of women, and they were young women. Perpetua was like about 19. Felicity was her maid, was her handmaid, and they were, and Perpetua was pregnant. And so there was a huge persecution, and this was in the early couple centuries of the church, the first couple of centuries of the church, a huge persecution under one of the Roman emperors. And they actually were martyred. They were eaten by wild beasts, and there were about 13 of them that were together. And Perpetua and Felicity were, they refused, like Perpetua would not, they didn't want to execute Perpetua while she was pregnant. And she decided to have her baby. She tried to, she had her baby and went to go get eaten anyway. And she died, she wanted to die with them. And that was her only regret. And she wrote a very moving letter about her experience. And so the two of them have been canonized in both the Orthodox and Catholic traditions. And they were very famous saints. Another one is Saint Anthony. It turns out that not only did Christian scholarship began in Africa in the Egyptian church, and then also um, many grave heresies, several rather grave heresies started there, but also monasticism. And Saint Anthony was an Egyptian brother, an African brother, who actually was the fourth starter of monasticism, to actually going out in the wilderness of lone monasticism that started to spread, and it was very popular in Egypt. Now, one of the reasons is that the African churches there were two centers of theology and two schools and approaches to Bible interpretation. One was in Antioch, and Antioch is more like we are, more of a literal interpretation. They looked at the Bible as history, looked at the commandments as commandments, and so forth. The Alexandrian school was a lot more allegorical, and so because of that, likely because of that, it was more of a place for meditation, for withdrawal from the world, and so forth. And so St. Anthony started the monasticism that we know today as Christian monasticism early on in the 3rd century. His disciple, Pachymonius, started what was called Cenobitic monasticism, which is the more organized monasticism into organized communities. By the time St. Pachymonius came around, he was aware of St. Anthony and realized that there needed to be a little more structure. There was all these people going off in the wilderness, not coming back, and so forth. And it was helpful to have them be able to support each other, to encourage each other to work in communities, grow food, and those sorts of things. And Pachymonius is actually the brother that started all of that, this African brother. And there was an African woman too who started the nunnery type of style that we have now. So with Pachymonius, if we're looking at in the Catholic tradition, for instance, the Benedictines, the Dominicans, and Jesuits, and all those the different monastic groups, well, not the Jesuits, but the Benedictines and the Dominicans, the different monastic groups, they owe their root to Saint Pachymonius from Africa. Also, they were so influential that the Russian Orthodox Church was asking them for manuals and training to start Orthodox monasteries there as well in Russia. So these were very impactful brothers and sisters, and very impactful church that God raised according to his prophecy in Egypt and in Ethiopia. So Origen was the greatest teacher in Alexander. We've talked about him a bit. Tertullian, he was around in the 2nd, 3rd century as well. He was a phenomenal contributor to theology. That's another thing, is that a lot of the doctrines that we believe were helped develop and were articulated by African thinkers and African theologians. Tertullian is one of them. He was one of the first ones to write to use the word Trinity in Latin, and to actually name the Trinity that became the doctrine, that around which the doctrine consolidated later on. The doctrine was already there, but he named it. He was a great Latin writer. And another one is Athanasius, and Athanasius was very active in anti-Arianism, and Pastor Harris had talked about Arianism. And Arius was a heretic who believed that that Jesus Christ was a created being. Now, what he was doing, he was responding to another heretic named Sabellius, who believed that that God was just one person wearing three hats, which is modalism or Sabellianism, instead of being separate persons with the same essence, which we've grown to articulate it that way. Athanasius was a very active anti-Arian, and he helped articulate and formulate some of the language that we use today to describe the Trinity. And then lastly, there was a special mention of a brother named Saint Moses the Black, or Saint Moses the Ethiopian. And Moses the Black was a very colorful figure. He basically was a thug. He was a hoodlum back in that day, like the 4th or 5th century, and he became a monk, and he was converted by the teachings and by just befriending one of the monks that was there. And he ended up dying when thieves came into the monastery. He had all the rest of them go away. He took out about 4 or 5 of them, and then he got killed. But he was quite a colorful character. And the Orthodox Church actually has a an order of Saint Moses the Black within their within Orthodoxy. It's a very fascinating figure. Now,
Hey, Robert,
yes.
let me interrupt you just for a second to give you a time check. We got probably another 11, 12 minutes.
Okay.
Is that good?
So let's okay, then we'll just go through a couple more and then move on.
Okay.
So then let's then pre-European African Christianity. It turns out that there was Christianity spread throughout Africa before Europeans ever arrived. So this is Congo, and the Congo actual nation was this, you see how far this is from Egypt. Is that this is in the 1400s? The Portuguese came around in the 1460s into this area. They were already Christians here. There was a Christian king, and there was then in the 1500s later. After that, there was a man named Alfonso I who wrote the Pope, because the Portuguese were actually capturing Congolese Christians as slaves and taking them across the Atlantic for the slave trade. So what they did, and before then, Mansa Musa in Mali, there's Arabic recordings of Christians in the 1200s and 1300s that were already there, of course, over 200 years before any Europeans ever arrived. So there's Mali, there's Congo, and then up to 10% of West Africans enslaved in the Atlantic slave trade were already Christians, and some of them were Muslims as well. But the whole idea that the slavers forced Christianity onto Africans is completely false, because they enslaved existing Christians and took them across the Atlantic. The slavers did. Here's some other ones. Like there's Pope Victor I was a Black pope. This is from a book called The History of Black Catholics in America by Cyprian Davis, if you're interested in that. There was a Black pope who was Victor I, and this was in the 2nd century, right? The end of the 2nd century. Pope Milades, and this is in the early 4th century, Black pope. And then another pope who was in the 5th century. And then there was a Congolese bishop of the Madeira Islands as early as 1521. So these are the Madeira Islands, they're right off the coast of Africa. So we see without God using Africa in formation of the early church and doctrine, the church would not be in the same form that we have it today. Watch these videos for more about Africa in the Bible, Africa in the early church, and a wide variety of other Bible topics. God bless you, and see you there.